And I'm the Dean of the College of Communication, Information, and Media here, and we have a very exciting day in store for you. At 2:30, the first non-professional production of the Pulitzer Prize-winning play Wit is going to be performed in the UniverCity Theater, followed by commentary and analysis from Margaret Edson, the author. At 3 o'clock on this stage, Billy Evans' Horse will return with his group of Native Tribal American dancers. I saw them this morning. They're great. So you want to be here to see that too. At 6:30, also here, Steve Ostad will give a talk on why we age. Then at 8 o'clock, PBS program host and science writer James Burke will be also in this tent to talk about the history of science. Are you ready for all that? And that is just day one of UniverCity. This is going on until next Friday. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that our interpreter today is Rebecca Bahan, and that our campus chapter of Amnesty International, under the leadership of advisor Jerry Waite, is handling the Moratorium 2000 petitions, and they'll be circulating, I think, throughout the event here. The sponsor of this event is the Provost Lecture Series. Now I know you must be ready for the main event. We are here to meet Sister Helen Prejean, and it's my pleasure to introduce her. Her arrival is apropos. This is, after all, a Jubilee year, a time of renewal, forgiveness, and justice that has been practiced from the earliest times of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Roman Colosseum, that symbol of horrible torture and capital punishment as a form of mass entertainment, has been converted into a symbol of mercy this year. And every time a death row inmate in the world has been allowed to live, its edifice has been bathed in a cloak of golden light. We've seen capital punishment become an issue in the presidential campaigns as its use in Texas comes under national scrutiny. And we've even seen Pat Robertson undergo a personal conversion that led him to rebuke capital punishment. Most of you will know Sister Helen from her book Dead Man Walking, or from the film of that same name in which she was portrayed by Susan Sarandon. Let me tell you a little more about her. She's been a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph in New Orleans since 1957. Her experiences there led her to become a prison minister, and that involved counseling both death row inmates and also the victims' families. She's accompanied 5 men to execution. Dead Man Walking, first published in 1993, has been translated into 10 languages and is currently being adapted as an opera, which will premiere next month in San Francisco, I think. Right? Dead Man Walking is about capital punishment and the moral imperatives it raises for civilized societies in general and Christians in particular. It is about how forgiveness, both from the victim and from the society, frees us all from prison. And indeed, it has been said that a society will ultimately be judged on its capacity for mercy, for the weak, for the poor, for the young, the elderly, the sick, and for its prisoners. Sister Helen wants future history to remember us as a more merciful society. That may seem like a daunting task, but I'm going to quote from her here for a moment. God makes a way out of no way. That's the main story of Dead Man Walking, but you will also find in it a more imminent and personal eschatology. Dead Man Walking is also the story about how we need to reconcile ourselves to God. Not just those who are literally prisoners, but all of us. It's about being honest with ourselves about our lives and being willing to accept God's grace before that end to which we will all come. Our penal system creates a situation in which death row inmates know when their end will come. But for the rest of us, it will come like a thief in the night. A thief in the night. Are we ready as a culture? Are you ready as a person? Her topic is moral issues of the death penalty. Are you ready for Sister Helen Prejean?
Thank you. Boy, when I saw this program and all the stuff y'all got going on here, I wish I could stay here a week. All these wonderful speakers and things going on. You can relax. I mean, we're going to talk about morality, but I'm a storyteller. And I believe if you can take people into experiences and invite people to reflect, It's like then we come to deeper parts of our hearts that we didn't know we had. I want to talk to you a little bit first about just some stories around what happened with the movie and the opera. Tim Robbins is writing the play of Dead Man Walking. I'm about to get the first draft of it, which I'm very excited about because the play will make its way here, and it can be performed here and in little theaters all across this country, which will enable us another way of going through this journey and reflecting on the death penalty. I know that this is an issue that confronts us, you know. Somebody's happy about the play. It was probably the drama department here, huh? The death penalty is such an emotional issue because, of course, we feel so outraged over people's crimes against innocent people. And the question is, what are we going to do with the outrage? And that's the journey part. So to have this issue and the journey it takes us on come through the arts is a great gift. And the reason I was so happy about the film Dead Man Walking was because I knew it would be one of the ways the American public could begin to reflect on the death penalty. Because when people are executed in this country, it's almost a private act. It's behind prison walls. Few people are allowed in. And I think that's by design. Tim Robbins did the screenplay and the movie, but Susan Sarandon is really the one, I call her the midwife of the film, because the way the film happened was like this. First, I wasn't seeking for him to go do the film because Hollywood and nuns usually don't mix too well. And if you're not a flying nun or sister act, I mean, I know they're not going to get it right, all right? So one day the phone rings, I pick it up, the voice on the other end says, "Hi, I'm Susan Sarandon, I'm filming a client in Memphis. I got to come to New Orleans for a couple of days of filming. I'm reading your book, I'd love to meet you." I say, "Great." I had heard about Susan Sarandon through Amnesty International, who's here today, and I'm going to refer you to them when we finish this talk. But, you know, she's going to come to the restaurant, and I want to know what she looks like, so go rent Thelma and Louise. We look at Thelma and Louise. And I got her mixed up with Gina Davis in the first scene. And if you know the story of Thelma and Louise, Gina Davis was that ditzy one who kept doing more and more stupid things and keep getting in more and more trouble, you know. But so when Susan walks into the restaurant, I just said, "Oh, thank God she's Louise." You know, I was just so relieved. Of course, you know, I told that story to everybody but Susan. I was embarrassed, you know, I didn't know who she was. Susan Sarandon, big deal, you know. So finally, after the movie's made, we were all at a party celebrating that the film had been made. And I said, "You know, Susan, I've got a confession to make to you." And she stood back like this and went, "Gina Davis." She handled it well. So we have this little talk together in this restaurant. And she's the one who said, "Look, I'm going to bring this to Tim. He's the one to do this film." Tim was busy on all these other projects. She couldn't get him to read the book. She'd periodically call me. Over 6 months, she'd call me. "I can't get him to read the book. I can't get him to read the book." I'm going, "Susan, look, I didn't have a big thing about a film being made. I didn't even know what impact it was going to have." So I said, "Look, we got time." And she said, no, we don't have time. It's urgent that we do this film." Finally, she prevailed on him. Then I went up to New York, sat with him in their living room, talked about making a film. Naively, I thought if Tim Robbins is a screenwriter, Susan Sarandon's in it, Sean Penn's in it, I thought every Hollywood studio was going to be knocking down their door to do this film. Wrong. And Tim, I'd say, "Tim, how we doing?" He goes, "I'm turning gray." He says, "It gets up to the second highest echelon in the movie, the Hollywood studios, and they turn it down." And they tell me something like, you know, he said, "Well, you know, the 3 magic bullets for blockbuster films are a lot of sex, a lot of violence, a lot of action. And the heart of this film is a conversation between you, a nun, and a death row inmate. And they don't think it can go." And they telling me, "Well, Tim has got no romantic element in it." Now, if we could beef up the part of the nun and the death row inmate. And he won't let them touch that. And then they say, "Tim, he did a terrible crime, and he's going to be executed then. This is a downer." And Tim said, "It has redemption in it." Nah. Polygram Film International, which only had one successful movie because they were mainly doing albums, picked up Dead Man Walking. It got 4 nominations for the Academy Award. Bruce Springsteen's song, Dead Man Walking was performed at the Academy Awards with 1.3 billion people in the world watching, and Susan got the Academy Award for her portrayal of me. She'd been nominated 4 other times, had never gotten an Academy Award. Everybody's telling her, Susan, you're going to win this year. She said, God, there's no kind of nervousness or pressure than being a front runner. And when Susan stepped up on that stage at the Academy Awards with all those people, you know, she was, I don't know if you saw this, but she truly was like breathless. And it brought the movie to the world. And that's what led it to be translated in all the different languages. I mean, I was with a taxi cab driver in Japan. He's going, Dead Man Walking. I mean, it went all around the world. And I guess one of the things I want to say to you is we do our part with as much integrity as we know, and then we turn it over, you know, and forces of good take it over. And there's a great palpable movement in the world at this time for human rights. 100 countries in the world now have turned back the death penalty and either have a moratorium or outright abolition on the death penalty. There's something moving in the universe, and the name of it is human rights. And that's why chapters like Amnesty International, which are here on this campus, and I urge you to join them if you're not already a part of that, because it changes your consciousness to be part of groups like this so that you know what's going on in the world. One little bit about the music of Dead Man Walking. Tim Robbins starts making the film. Then he gets this idea, hey, because see, his daddy knew Arlo Guthrie, and music is big in Tim's family. His brother Dave works with music, and so we got this idea. I could send a rough cut of the film to all these big music stars and ask them to write an original composition, and we'll put it together in an album. In the middle of this project, he said to me, I must be out of my cotton-picking mind to have undertaken to do this album while we're trying to do the film. Because, of course, you know, you have all these snags and things. He got Bruce Springsteen on board to do the title song of Dead Man Walking. But then what he did, he sent the rough cut to people like Eddie Vedder with Pearl Jam, Mary Chapin Carpenter, I mean, you know, all kinds of movie people. And then, of course, he started getting the responses. Eddie Vedder with Pearl Jam, he calls Tim up on the phone. He said, Tim, listen, I got your invitation. He said, but I got to tell you, he says, man, he says, I'm for the death penalty. He said, in fact, I got out of Amnesty International because they saying, you know, they calling for an end to the death penalty. And Tim says to him, oh, Eddie, I didn't know. Well, look, maybe just look at the film, just see maybe if you move to do something. Well, lo and behold, Eddie Vedder looks at the rough cut of Dead Man Walking. And you know the film Dead Man Walking is not a polemic against the death penalty. It just takes you there. Takes you over to both sides. Sufferings of the victims, person being executed, person really guilty of a terrible crime. And Eddie Vedder calls Tim up after he looks at the film. He said, it took me there. He said, I realized I got to be against the death penalty. And he wrote a song called Dead Man Walking. It didn't make it onto Tim's album. But when there are Pearl Jam concerts, Eddie Vedder gets up and tells the story of his own change of heart about this issue before he sings the song Dead Man Walking. So we got the music out there, got the film out there, we'll have the play out there, and the opera of Dead Man Walking. It's going to be a wonderful opportunity, well, let me put it this way, to hit a niche of people I don't think we ever reached before. I don't go to operas much myself, but I'm learning a lot about this one, and the opening night is October 7th. And, you know, music can take us into places of our hearts that we don't know we have. And the way they've constructed the opera, and I've worked closely with the composer, the playwright is, the librettist is Terrence McNally, and I think they got it right. Now, let me tell you some of the experiences in my own journey that led me here. I didn't think or desire or plan that I'm going to be going on to death row and accompanying people to the electric chair and watching them die, being killed by lethal injection. And I'll tell you the thing that led me to it, if I give you the linchpin of it, is that I got involved with poor people. I grew up in an affluent family. My father was a lawyer. I had a private education, had excellent schooling in elementary, high school, college, but I wasn't directly in touch with poor people. For me, it was part of a religious conversion of understanding that Jesus was with poor people, and that to follow the way of Jesus and to be a Christian really meant that I had to start crossing some boundaries and going into the inner city and being there with people who were poor and struggling. Racism is a tremendous struggle in this country. I'm going to find out a lot about racism when I get involved with the death penalty. And so I crossed across all kind of lines, moved into the St. Thomas housing projects with African American community, poor people struggling against poverty and racism, and get an education I'd never had in my whole life. Or what it means to live on the underside of history, on the underside of the tapestry of the great American dream. Some people trying to hold down 2 jobs, mamas trying to make the decision if they gave up their pitiful little welfare check and lose the health care for their kids, or whether or not to go get a minimum paying job, which means to go put their children in child care, that their children wouldn't be with them, and then they're not getting out of poverty anyway because the minimum paying job doesn't pay them enough to get out of poverty. We got serious struggles in this society where 1 in every 4 of our children is living in poverty. Serious struggles. I kind of knew there were struggles, but I didn't directly know any people, and I was never in the neighborhoods. And if we never meet people and look in their eyes and we never hear their stories, it's like we're removed. Kind of like that little girl that time that wrote that essay called The Poor Family. She said once there was a very poor family. The whole family was poor. The mother was poor and the father was poor. The children were very poor. The chauffeur was poor, the gardener was poor, the butler was poor. It was a very poor family. Well, in a way, that was kind of like me, because I wasn't there. I wasn't with people. So I go to the St. Thomas housing projects, and I tell this whole story, the spiritual journey in Dead Man Walking. I had never written a book before. Instinctively, I knew, though, to tell it in first person, present tense, so as it happens to me, it happens to you. I was an English major in college, graduated, got my degree in the humanities. You know, and when you get an education, you never know how you're going to be using the stuff that you learn. We learn to write, we appreciate literature. You don't know how those gifts are going to be used. And everybody sitting in this audience today has had the benefit of resources in your life, and to go to a college, a university like this, to be part of educational things like this. You already have been placed on a track where special responsibility is given to you because you've already been given so much. But it takes time for us to know those gifts. And I waded through a lot of those courses in college, believe you me. And I never knew I was going to use writing, and that I was going to write this book, and that writing would be a way to really enter into the public debate on the death penalty. Anytime we have a voice, anytime we stand up to speak or write a letter to the editor, or write a letter on behalf of a political prisoner to ask for asylum for them, or for them to be freed. When we have a voice, we are a human being. When we are voiceless and mute and have no voice, it's like we're still in a dormant stage in our humanness. So creating a voice, giving voice to our person and what we believe is an important part of human development, which I'm going to learn. But at first, I wasn't writing a book because I didn't have that much to write about, you know. But boy, believe you me, accompanying 5 people to execution, and then also talking to these guards that are on the strap-down team that are going to do the execution, and then being in there with the murder victims' families, and then meeting the governor and the head of the pardon board and the warden who has to nod his head to be the first trigger of the execution. I got plenty to write about. And so what happened is, working in St. Thomas, right around the corner from where I was working at an adult learning center, where people came who had dropped out of high school, was a prison coalition office where people were working with prisoners. They'd get all kind of letters, there were all kind of needs. Louisiana has one of the worst prison systems in the world. I mean, the suffering that goes on in prisons is intense, and we throw people away for the longest sentences. An 18-year-old in Louisiana that pushes heroin one time with no prior drug offenses gets a mandatory life sentence in Louisiana. And it's become a very political thing for when politicians and legislators get together. Their top target is punishing criminals, punishing criminals. We now have 2 million people incarcerated in this country. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. So even as we cut or neglect social programs to keep people in the network of the community, we're building the other country and throwing them over behind walls, younger and younger people going in for adult sentences. And the death penalty is the tip of that iceberg. Not only do we incarcerate at the tune of $20,000 a year while we cutting down on these pitiful programs that barely give Head Start a chance, or to work with children, or to work with at-risk youth, or the public schools, or whatever, but yet we're willing to invest $20,000 a year to incarcerate somebody in prison for 40 years, for 30 years, for the rest of their life. It's a mixed, it's an inverted spiral of values. In California, 6 years ago, their education budget was always greater than their prison budget. And now their prison budget is so great they've been cutting education at higher levels in California. We don't want our society to go in that direction. We want to go in the direction of life, and where everybody in this society can lead a decent life. And that is what fills us with passion when we begin to get involved in these bigger things, the bigger issues of our day. And so what happened to me was, here I was in St. Thomas. One day a friend coming out of the Prison Coalition office is coming down the street with a little clipboard, had a little project going on. Believe me, this was casual, and I didn't plan it. And he bumps into me. And he says, hey, Sister Helen, you want to be a pen pal? Somebody on death row here in Louisiana. It was 1982. We hadn't executed anybody in Louisiana since the 60s. I'll figure. Yeah, sure, I said. I'll write a letter. Just to bring God into this a little bit, we got to watch God. God is really sneaky with us. Because I think all I'm going to do is write letters. It was 1982. We hadn't executed anybody. Do I know that they are going to execute this man in the electric chair on the night of April the 5th, 1984? And I'm going to write to him, and I'm going to be a spiritual advisor, and that he's going to be executed at midnight, and at 5:45, everybody's got to leave the death house but the spiritual advisor. And I'm going to walk with him, and I'm going to say to him, look at my face. When they do this thing, do you think I have any clue? I would never have written a letter. But see, God works with us. And God lifts us in grace, step at a time. So I got a name. Hey, I'll go back. Sister's apartment. We live in there among the people. And I announced this up. Hey, y'all, I'm going to start writing somebody on death row. Well, that's cool. I mean, the sister's doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, in there in the prison, in there with the people, just right in there. And I write the man. I wrote the man, and the man wrote back. And I always remember his first letter, because he said, Dear Sister Helen, couldn't believe it when the guards stopped by my cell. I know I wasn't writing to anybody, and here out of the blue, you write me this letter, and man, I'd love to be a pen pal. And we just started writing letters. Amnesty International does that. Letters have been written on behalf of people who are political prisoners and save their lives. A letter can be a very powerful thing. It looks like a very simple, ordinary thing when you do it. So lo and behold, I get the letter back from this guy. So then I write, he writes. I write, he writes. I write, he writes. It's like a little ping pong game of letters. But then it all unfolds. Because in the letters, I realized he doesn't have anybody to come see him. His mama went into that prison one time and almost had a nervous breakdown. She couldn't make herself. She'd had a hard life emotionally. She was fragile to begin with. She couldn't make herself walk through those gates and read death row and be in a place where the state was going to kill her boy. And he told her, look, Mama, you don't have to come see me. I know it's too hard on you, Mama. And so he gave her permission not to come, and she would write him letters. And so I'm thinking, I write him and I just say, look, I'll come and see you. And those of us who are sitting in here who are of the Christian faith, how many times had I meditated on the Gospel of Matthew chapter 25? I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was in prison and you came to me. But you know, we all are own little spin doctors with these scriptures when we read them. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I was in prison. Well, in many ways we imprison ourselves. And I was thirsty. Well, they got different kind of thirst, you know. Thirst for knowledge, thirst for whatever. So all those other times when I'd hit those words, I was in prison and you came to me, I never thought they applied to me. But now that I met this man through these letters and he's got nobody and he's alone and he's condemned to death, I mean, his address is death row. I've never written anybody who lived on waiting to die street before in my whole life. And so I say, I will come and see you. And it all unfolds out of that. Of course, everything unfolds out of personal contact between human beings. I go see the man. They lock me. They bring me through these gates. I said, how many gates are we going to go through? I was scared by then, see. I got myself into it then. They're walking me through the gates. I said, I'm in the belly of the beast. This is the belly of the beast. And they keep locking the gates behind me, then lock me in a room. And then they say, we'll get your man. And I hear him coming with the guard. He had leg irons on, and I heard him drag the chains across that cement floor. And ironically, the last sound, one of the last, will be as I walk with him to execution, I will look down at those chains, the leg irons being dragged across the highly polished tile floors of the death house, which is kept clean and immaculate. But see, I don't know that then. All I know is he's coming. We have 2 hours to visit. I look up through this heavy mesh screen, and I think in the back of my mind, when we got close to the visit, I thought, man, he did kill somebody. What's he really like? Am I like going to be able to have a normal conversation? Like, is he human like I'm human? And what are we going to talk about? And I started getting nervous about him, see? And then there he was. And I looked through the screen, and I couldn't believe how human his face was. I thought, whatever he has done, there is more to him as a human being than the worst act he has done. He said, Sister Helen, you came. You made that drive all that way. The 2 hours flew. I really didn't have to say much, because he did most of the talking. To have a loving presence come to see him. We have 5,000 guys at our maximum security prison in Louisiana, still called Angola, because slaves from Angola work this 18,000 acre plantation, so everybody still calls it Angola. 5,000 men, over half of whom are serving life sentences, 75% of whom are African American, average educational level 3rd grade. Half of them have never received a postcard or a letter of visit from anybody. So when he says to me, Sister Helen, thank you for making the drive to come and see me, it not only made his day, it made his month, and it made his year, that somebody had come to see him. Because one of the biggest struggles of incarceration is to keep your dignity. Because you're made to feel like a number. Guards are mixed. Some of the guards are great at Angola. They're human beings that really look out after the humanity of the men they guard. Others, they get that authority, and boy, they want to take it out. And so you never know when you're making your way through the daily routine of a prison day if you're going to be treated like garbage 1 minute or what, and you're counted 4 times a day. You wear clothes like everybody else. There's nothing to distinguish your person or your voice. And so to have a visit, to get a letter, really says to you, you're a human being. In the process of visiting with him, I find out that his brother Eddie is serving 2 life sentences, and that was my first question about the legal system. Because my father had been an attorney, but I didn't listen a whole lot to all that legal stuff he talked about. I mean, you listen to legal stuff when you need to know the law, you're involved in some kind of way. But it was a question I had about the legal system, and when I first got involved with this, I didn't know anything about it. How is it one brother got life and one brother got death for the same murder? I didn't know. I'm going to find out a whole lot. And as I tell the story in Dead Man Walking, the reader finds out too about how the legal system and how the criminal justice system works. I mean, we are faced with a situation in this country where we've had 87 innocent people come off at death row. Some of them came real close to being executed, like Anthony Porter in Illinois. You know, there are 13 innocent people freed from death row in Illinois. Finally, the governor, George Ryan, conservative Republican, stood before microphones like this and declared a moratorium. He's in principle for the death penalty, but not like it's happening here, he said. His conscience and his sense of decency couldn't tolerate that innocent people An innocent person could be led to their death. Now, one of those 13 people was Anthony Porter. Anthony Porter was 2 days away from execution. There was no question of his innocence, the court said, but they had a question about his mental competence to be executed. Mental competence is one of the requirements. You got to know you're being killed in order for the state to execute you. And we've had some people who have been executed in this country, like Ricky Ray Rector in Arkansas, who had a frontal lobotomy. He had blown out the front part of his brain with a gun. He's saving the pie from his last meal to eat later when they executed him. I don't know how they tested out his mental competence, but at any rate, a stay of execution is given to Anthony Porter. And journalism students at Northwestern were assigned by their professor to take this case, look into it. I met them, two of the journalism students, at an event in New York. The journalism students, within 2 weeks, cracked open the whole case, went to the town, talked to people, found the murderer. Everybody knew who the real murderer was. The real murderer confessed. And Anthony Porter was freed off of death row and reunited with his family. That's 2 days away from execution. Some people say, well, see, the system works. The innocent ones are coming off of death row. That's got nothing to do with the courts. And I'm going to find out about how the courts work. Because a lot of time, in the beginning, I honestly thought everybody on death row was guilty. It would be rare. And the American public thought that too. When we put the death penalty back in 1976 in the Gregg v. Georgia decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, only 15% of the American public thought an innocent person might get in there with the guilty. Because we trust our court system. And people said, you mean with all them endless appeals? They got too many appeals. There's no way an innocent person is going to get stuck in there with the guilty. Not with our appeals process. But one of the first things I'm going to learn is, did you know if your attorney during trial doesn't raise formal objections about certain issues, the gates close in the courts and the courts never listen to that issue? If you don't establish your innocence at trial, 95% of the justice is done. And in the case of Anthony Porter, once those gates shut after the trial and that jury had found him guilty and convicted him and sentenced him to death, no court had looked at that issue again of innocence. You can't bring it up in the courts. It and some of the other issues too. And that's why these 87 people, if you could hear some of the stories, it's like Randall Dale Adams. He's sitting in a death row cell in Texas, accused and convicted and sentenced to death for killing a policeman in Dallas. He was a drifter. He had come in the city. He said, I didn't kill no policeman. Yeah, tell it to the judge. Yeah, y'all innocent. And he's sitting in a death row cell, and he is moving toward an execution, and a film director got interested in his story and goes in there and talks to Randall Dale Adams, goes to start interviewing people for the film. He goes, my God, this guy's innocent. That's the thin blue line. And Randall Dale Adams will come and stand at this podium and tell you next year when you have this, he'll be glad to tell you his story of how he was almost executed in Texas, except a film director got in there. You have scrappy citizens, like members of Amnesty International, get in these cases. Sometimes you dig and find the original police report where, and appreciate, just appreciate that there is pressure on district attorney's office when, like that policeman that had been killed in Dallas, it was the longest unsolved murder of a policeman that had gone on in the city of Dallas. The pressure to get somebody is very strong. The whole community saying, who killed this policeman? We want the person who killed this policeman. And so you can understand, it's a human thing. If they feel they got the person, sometimes they're going to suppress exculpatory evidence, or like the police record, maybe an original eyewitness. When you look at the original police record, the eyewitness will say it was dark, it was at night, I didn't have my glasses, I wasn't sure. But with a little coaching along, by the time you come to the trial, you got the eyewitness saying, yep, and did this in Randall's case. That's him. That's the one who killed the policeman. I saw it. And then you get in there and then you say, and you see, prosecutors are supposed to turn over exculpatory evidence to the defense. It's called the Brady issue. They're supposed to turn over Brady material. But it's kind of just up to them to do it or not do it. If they don't, Judge gives them a little slap on the wrist. There's no censorship for that. And people get under pressure. And the death penalty brings pressure into the community. That jury, imagine how that jury felt when Anthony Porter, whom they had sentenced to death, but they weren't playing with a full deck. And here's why we can't fix the system. Now, Indiana, as you know, has been declared by your governor to look into your own death penalty. But meanwhile, Indiana's continuing to execute people while the study's being done. Your governor didn't do what Governor George Ryan did. He said, we'll have a moratorium on the death penalty while we study it. Your governor at least said we'll have a study, but if anybody comes up for execution in this process, they're dead in this process here. Because you need to look into the whole thing of, look at the jury. The reason it can't work is, overwhelmingly, when the death penalty is sought, it's poor people selected to pay for their crimes with their death. Not that poor people don't do terrible crimes. They do. In fact, we know the crime areas of our city, and often it's connected with poverty. But here's the thing, and here's the main thing I learned, first from Pat Saunier, then every other person I've been with. They're all poor. And when you're poor, what kind of defense do you get? And for justice to happen at trial, we have to have a full adversarial system, which means prosecution has forensic evidence, prosecution has expert witnesses, and defense has expert witnesses, and defense has forensic evidence. And often what happens, because poor people have court-appointed attorneys, public indigent defenders who are not given many funds and often are overworked, it's a wash when you get in the court. It's an unequal thing, that all the resources come from the prosecution side and the defense attorneys are not able to do what they need. And so we have this. It's not a fluke that innocent people are on death row with the guilty, but it's like they couldn't marshal the defense and the forces they need. One of the reasons Governor George Ryan called for the moratorium, he said some of these cases were so flimsy that it was on the word of a jailhouse snitch alone that sent a person to death. And a jailhouse snitch is a person who sits in a cell with you and says, yep, it was on Friday night, November the 8th, and I heard him confess to me because he trusted me. Yeah, like Randall Dale Adams, I killed a policeman. All you got is that guy's word against him. There's no evidence to support this, and he gets a reduced sentence for giving this information. Who can trust that? And that's one of the reasons Governor Ryan granted the moratorium. All of these are some of the legal issues that get involved because the way the death penalty is slanted, poor people are selected. It's a very selective process, as I'm going to find out in this journey. 17,000 homicides in this country every year, and 1.5% of people who do those murders are chosen for death. 1.5%. And the slant that comes in, or the bias with race, is overwhelmingly it's when white people are killed that the death penalty is sought. And when you hear the rhetoric, oh, we're going to reserve the death penalty for people who do the grievous, heinous, most terrible crimes, yeah, almost always that means when people do grievous, heinous, terrible crimes against white people. When people of color are killed in this country, often there's a shrug of the shoulders, and well, that's what those people do. When white people are killed, and when I did the research for Dead Man Walking, I found out in the history of this country to do a crime against a white person or their property has always garnered the toughest punishment. It's not to say white people should be killed. Nobody should be killed. Nobody should be subjected to violence. But when we go to apply the criminal justice system, we feel a lot more outrage and identification with some victims. Other victims, we just kind of let it go. There's just a shrug of the shoulders. So how could we apply the death penalty? Some people say, well, let's just make it fair. Let's just do it across the board. Then throw into the equation the discretionary power that district attorneys have. You can be side by side in a county. Johnny Holmes in Harris County in Texas has put more people on death row in Texas than any other prosecutor. Right next to him in another county is a prosecutor and a district attorney who doesn't go for the death penalty at all. So side by side, depends on where did you do the murder, in whose district did you do it, is the DA going to go for first degree murder, who was the victim, did the media cover it, does the community care, or will we bump it down to second degree, will we bump it down to manslaughter, will we do a plea bargain or not? All that's part of the system. So when you hear the rhetoric, oh yeah, we're going to have the death penalty just for those people who do these heinous, terrible crimes, how are we going to apply that? When you go into the court, U.S. Supreme Court, it says equal justice under law. And I find it hard to walk through those porticos and know what our Supreme Court has been doing with these cases. There is no equal justice under law. And money talks, and one of the sayings is, capital punishment means them without the capital get the punishment. Class definitely plays part in this, if you're poor or not. And then, as I've mentioned before, race. I'm going to learn all of this. But the first step, I visit with the guy. I find out his brother's in prison too. And then I went over to the Prison Coalition office after several months had gone by visiting the two prisoners. And I said, could I have some background material on this Saunier case? Because I didn't want to be naive. I knew there'd been a murder. And I would trust, if they trusted me enough, they could reveal to me. I don't go in there and visit, you know. This is just part of basic sensitivity. Oh, tell me what you did. Maybe I'll write a book. Who knows? But I didn't want to be naive. And I go into the Prison Coalition office and I ask, and they bring out all these legal folders. And I opened up the top of the heap, opened up the very first folder, and look into the faces of two beautiful teenage kids. It was the Daily Iberian in a little town called New Iberia, Louisiana, right in the middle of Acadiana, where all the Cajun people live. It was November the 5th, 1977. And the picture of Loretta Bourque in her prom outfit with David LeBlanc in his prom outfit, 17, 18 years old, on the front pages of this newspaper. Not because they got some kind of award, but with the terrible headline, Teenagers Found Murdered. And then I read the story and read about these two men that I'm visiting, whose human rights I'm standing for, whose dignity, the whole bit. And I read what they did. I read that they had rifles that night and they were rabbit hunting near a sugarcane field. And these innocent kids, coming from a homecoming football game, came to one of the lovers' lanes to park near this sugarcane field. The two brothers come up to the car. They had done this with other teenage couples before, though no one had been killed. And said, hey, you kids are trespassing. This is private property. We're the security guards here. And that led to, if the girl has sex with us, we won't report you, which is aggravated rape. But this night, these two kids are found lying face down with bullet holes in the backs of their heads. And I read this. And now I know. Now I know what the crime was. And I think of them. I think of their faces. Pat's face, how glad he is to see me, how human he is. I think of Eddie. They did this. I don't have any doubt about that. And then I think about the parents, because this is every parent's worst nightmare. And when we experience the rage inside of ourselves, when we read about things like this, or maybe even people we know. I was just over at Purdue University giving a talk, and a young woman asked to see me. Both her parents and her sister were murdered by a crack cocaine guy, clean out of his mind, stabbed and killed all of her family. Not all of her family. She has some other sisters, but her parents, her sister. When we hear these crimes, of course we feel outrage. I mean, it's part of moral sensitivity to feel outrage. And it's also part of why we struggle so hard with the death penalty, because we feel this ambivalence in ourselves. Outraged over this terrible, which indeed I feel as I read this, and now I know it. And once that knowledge was part of me, it could never be the same again, because I was always in a kind of tension. On the one hand, standing for the humanity of these people and Pat, and that he shouldn't be executed, but on the other, thinking of these beautiful young people ripped out of life, and it's like it's so wrong, and you're so outraged over it, that the emotions pour over into the moral decision and just go, they deserve to die. That's the way we feel. And that's why we struggle so with this issue. And I think of the parents, and then I think, I should go see those parents. But I didn't know how to handle it. I was scared. I'd never done it before. And I'm going, they're going to be mad. They're going to be so angry. They're probably all for the death penalty. Because when a society has a death penalty and your child's been killed and the DA comes to your house and says, we're thinking of seeking the death penalty to have justice for your dead child, and you say to them, well, we don't want the death penalty. I've had some victims' family who've done that, and they had people tell them, well, didn't you love your child? This is the ultimate punishment. You're not going for it? Something missing here? So I figured they must both be for the death penalty. They would be very angry. And I made a terrible mistake. A terrible mistake. I didn't go see those families. I stayed away from them. And I had a good editor. When I wrote Dead Man Walking and I did the first draft, my editor looked at it. When it came to this part, I kind of downplayed this with the parents, you know. He said, well, Helen, you have here that you were confused. You'd never done anything like this before. You weren't sure what to do. But he said, Helen, it was cowardice, wasn't it? I mean, you were scared, weren't you? I went, yeah, I was. He said, look, when you write your book, tell about your mistakes. Because people in following your journey are going to look for honesty in you. And if you kind of downplay your mistakes and only take people on the peaks of waves and don't take them down into the trough, take them on your whole journey. Well, this was a big mistake. And you know, when I met the victim's family, I met them at the pardon board hearing, which is a public hearing, the last act before a person's executed in Louisiana, and that's when I meet the victim's family. It's the worst possible time to try to have dialogue with a victim's family, because when you go into the pardon board hearing in Louisiana, you sign a register which side you're on. Are you for the state executing the person, or are you on the side of the defendant, which means that you're going to ask for clemency, that he not be executed? It's close to the amphitheater thing, thumbs up or thumbs down. And that's when I met the victim's family. It was at this pardon board hearing. And the pardon board was behind closed doors. And then we were walking outside. The Bork family, who had lost their child, their Loretta, they saw me coming. They put their eyes down. They walked past me. They were so angry at me they couldn't even speak. And right behind them was Lloyd LeBlanc and his wife, Eula. And I braced myself. I said, it's going to be so bad. They're going to be so angry. And up they walked. And Lloyd LeBlanc came right up to me. He said, Sister, I'm Lloyd LeBlanc. It's our son David who was killed. This is my wife Eula. And then he said to me, Sister, where you been? We had nobody to talk to with this. You can't believe the pressure we under with this death penalty thing. And I'm shocked out of my cotton-picking mind. Because at the pardon board, Godfrey Bork said to Lloyd, man, you got to talk for us. I'm so emotional I could blow it for us. We need somebody cool up there. You need to be the one. And so when they had asked, and what is the wishes of the victim's family, Lloyd LeBlanc had just spoken and said, we desire the execution to proceed. And now he's looking into my eyes and he's saying, Sister, where you been? We had nobody to talk to, nobody to support us in this. And I realized what a terrible mistake. And I'm so lame, so guilty. I just said, oh, Miss LeBlanc, I'm sorry about your son. I didn't think you wanted to see me, Mr. LeBlanc. And he was real Cajun, Frenchy. He said, "Mais sister, but sister, may you don't know what I think unless you're going to come talk to me. We're going to come have a cup of coffee, and you're going to find out what I think." And I wanted to say to him, you don't know what a coward I am. But this man, Lloyd LeBlanc, in Dead Man Walking, he's the hero. Not me. I bumbled into this, and I'm doing my best. I haven't been in the fire he's been in. He's been in the ultimate fire of having a child killed by violence. And he chose the road of reconciliation and forgiveness rather than vengeance. An incredible thing to me. And I go and pray with him in this little chapel, which is why they ended the film Dead Man Walking with Earl Delacroix, who approximates Lloyd LeBlanc, but none of the characters are exact, and praying together. At the end of the film Dead Man Walking, and Lloyd LeBlanc takes me, I go and pray with him in this little chapel. And in the course of finding out his story, I find I am in the presence of a human being who has had his child killed and who chooses the way of forgiveness and reconciliation. He told me, only after we got to know each other well, when the sheriff's deputies came to him to bring him to the morgue to identify David's body. And everybody loved David. Even the kindergarten kids, when they interviewed kids at school who could have hurt David LeBlanc, nobody could think who would hurt David LeBlanc. Even the little kindergarten kid said, he played with us on a merry-go-round. Everybody loved this kid. And there's Lloyd LeBlanc now looking at the body of his son on that cold tray in the morgue. And the prayer that rose to his lips was a prayer he had learned as a child. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And when he came to the words in the Our Father, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, he had said the words of the prayer. He told me later, I didn't feel the words, but I knew Jesus told us to forgive, and he set his face to start walking down that road and to speak in religious terms, spiritual terms. The grace of God met him on that road, and he was able to come to a point of forgiving the people who killed his boy. And not only that, here's another thing. When we think of victims' families, there's another family. The family of the one who's executed. Can we call them a victim's family? Well, look at what happened to Miss Sonier, whose sons had done this terrible murder. She couldn't go into the grocery store in St. Martinville, the little town where she lived, because she could hear people saying, there's the mother of the murderers, that white trash mother. What kind of way did she raise those kids? And she disconnected her phone because people are doing these phone calls. The rage and anger vented on the one executed in society spills over into the family, and there's no way to stop that. Because it's like our society is legalizing and sanctifying and justifying revenge. And so when the anger spills over into the mamas, to the family, it goes with it. There's no way we can have the death penalty and not have these families exposed to this kind of anger. People were cutting up cats and throwing them on Miss Sonier's front porch. She became like a little hermit in her house. And one day her doorbell rang and she went to the front door, and Lloyd LeBlanc was standing there. And he had a basket of fruit. And he said, Miss Sonier, may I come in? She nodded her head. And he said, I brought you this fruit. I just want to say to you that as parents, none of us really know what our kids might do. And I don't hold you responsible for what your boys did to our son. Did you know in Texas, when people are executed and you have witnesses and the victim's family sits on the front row, that there's another room with no chair where the mother is going to stand whose child is about to be killed by the state? We multiply victims' families. And we don't have to keep going down this road. We're the only Western industrialized country in the world that still has a death penalty. And not only do we have it for juveniles, one of 5 countries in the world. Amnesty can give all that kind of good information. One of only 5 countries that says when people are juveniles, they can be executed. It was one of the first steps taken by the United Nations to start drawing back on the death penalty and say at least juveniles won't be executed. Well, we execute juveniles. We execute the mentally retarded. Now, we say we don't execute the mentally incompetent, but it's usually the state psychiatrist that examines people to see if in fact they're competent to be executed or not. And all the press is for the death penalty to happen. Do we have to keep going down this road? What I want to ask you to reflect on today is we don't have to keep going down this road. In 14 states now, there is a push for a moratorium on the death penalty, and moratorium is a graceful, good first step to stop it. It's like a ceasefire in a war. Doesn't mean you have to sign the whole peace treaty, but can we stop killing people while we take a look at this thing? And it's happening worldwide. We hope to present at Kofi Annan at the UN on December 10th, Human Rights Day, 2.5 million signatures. Most of them have come from other countries, but a number of them are coming from this country. And I want to ask you, if you know where you are on this issue, and you can sign that moratorium, that you not leave this tent without doing that today, and asking Amnesty International members here on the campus how you might get further involved. Here's an important thing to know. For 15 years, I've been getting on airplanes and going and talking about this issue to people. So I've met people all across this country, and I mean from Rotary clubs in Houston to people in church basements to universities. And sometimes you hear people say, and this is an argument for safety, yeah, but listen, if we don't execute them, they could get out in a few years and they could kill again. I saw this thing in Parade magazine, of 48 Hours of 2020, or Reader's Digest, or somewhere. This person was a murderer, and they let him out, and sure enough, he killed again. The only way we can be safe is if we execute him, and that way we know they'll never kill again. Now, that's an argument for safety. That's not an argument for retribution. It's not, I want to punish them so bad that I want to do to them what they did to their victim, and killing them is the only way to do this. It's that we got to protect our kids, and we have to be safe as a society. Can we be safe as a society without resorting to execution? What do other societies in the world do? You need to know that over the last 10 years, Indiana included, state legislatures all across this country have tightened up sentencing for first degree of felony murder. That's murders with certain aggravating circumstances for which you could get the death penalty. And that anybody sentenced under those new sentencing protocols are not walking out of prison in a few short years. Most states truly have life without parole sentences. And all I'm telling you is, I'm giving you that piece of information that exists in your state, that we can be safe without having to imitate the violence. So in the end, in this journey that I talk about in this book, if I use the image of the cross, the Christian symbol, I'm on both arms of this cross, because I end up being with the death row inmate and his family and the murder victims. And Lloyd LeBlanc was the first one to bring me down that road, and then I began to go to support groups for murder victims' families. And you know what surprised me and shocked me the most about them was how many of them said that after the death of their child, after the funeral, nobody came to see them, or if they tried to bring up about their child, people changed the subject. Our culture is not real good at dealing with death or pain, and people were staying away from victims' families so that they were treated like pariahs on one end, and the death row inmate on the other, where people say they're not human like the rest of us, they're monsters, they're animals, they're beyond the pale, and they can be killed. The need in our society to have healing for victims' families, for faith communities, neighborhood communities, to reach out to people who have experienced violence so that they can come back into the community and be healed and not be isolated and left alone in their pain. So I did one small thing. But if each of us did one small thing, the healing and networking and connecting in our community could be accomplished. And mine was, started a murder victim support group in New Orleans, one little group, one little Rolade in the great big old stomach of society where there's just a lot of pain, but if we all do one little Rolade, we can help the pain of the world. Then I'm with this man, Patrick Saunier, who unbelievably to me, I couldn't believe this would happen. I had gotten him a good attorney in Atlanta, but it was too late in the process. I'm glad I didn't know that. I thought once we got a good attorney, because I found out all kinds of stuff about the case. He had had a man who had never had a capital case before. His defense attorney had met with him for 2 half-hour periods to get his case together. 2 half-hour periods. One was on the morning of the trial. So that means that defense attorney spent all of 1 hour with Patrick Saunier preparing his defense. The jury was selected in a day, on a Monday. By Thursday, they found him guilty. By Friday, they sentenced him to death. And you'll have to get the story from the book. This is one way to get you to read the book. Patrick Saunier was executed, and Eddie Saunier is the one who had killed the kids. By the time I got into the case, by the time we got lawyers in, no courts would hear it. It was all too late. And Eddie Saunier's incredible story is that his brother's executed and he's alive, and he comes to the wake of his brother and looks down in the coffin and sees Pat with the bandaged head, because his head had been shaved for the execution and his body was very burned, and looks down and says, now 3 people are dead because of me. I think he didn't go crazy, because Pat, before he died, wrote him a note, which Eddie read for 3 years before he went to sleep at night, about how, don't worry, God is going to take care of me. But Eddie, you got to keep your head and you can't lose your cool, which was how I found out the murders happened. He had a flashpoint inside of him, Eddie Saunier did, and he had a gun in his hands. And the flashpoint was, never look down on me because I was poor. Something happened in the interchange that night, and I don't know what it was. Something charged him. He described it as, I can barely remember the moment. I know I must have done it, but if I could only turn back the clock, he killed the kids. It's done. It's irrevocable. You can't bring it back. And so he reads this note from his brother, which I helped Patrick write because his hands were in handcuffed, and I wrote the note and he signed it. And he signed it, I love you, brother, and signed his name. This is just one more story. Not that Patrick Saunier was innocent totally, far from it. He was involved in that stuff they were doing with those teenage kids. Rape, aggravated rape. And he knew he was the one who always kept Eddie cool. And here they were getting involved in situations. And one night Eddie lost it. And Patrick felt as responsible as if he had pulled the trigger himself. He never used the word, I'm innocent. And he walked to his death and paid for what he had done. Though, as the story came out, I knew he wasn't really guilty of first-degree murder. And then, incredibly, I was involved in this execution process. Going into the death house 3 days ahead of time, polished tiles. We try to make this thing so clean. Now we don't have electric chairs most places. Lethal injection looks like you walk into a hospital room, clean white sheet on the gurney, put alcohol on your arm. Before we gonna kill you, get a germ-free death, huh? I mean, and it's because we're trying to make it clean. We don't want to look like we're killing anybody. You hear people say, yeah, well, look what he did to his victim. Yeah, they didn't have no spiritual advisor. Look what he did to his victim. But look at what we're doing. And the reason in human rights this has become an issue, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is we can't take the torture out of the death penalty. If they walking you across a room to the execution chamber and you're going to lie down on a gurney, or you're going to sit in a chair where electric current's going to come through your body, or they're going to shoot you with pin a little red heart on where they're going to shoot you with a rifle, or a gallows as they used in Washington state to hang a person, or to sit in that gas chamber as they did in Parchman prison in Mississippi, and as they have done in San Quentin until recently. The method is not the big thing on your mind. It's that I am being killed, and this is the last minutes of my life. And what most people have said to me in doing the walk is, sister, just pray God holds up my legs. How do you hold up your dignity as a human being when you're being marched into a room surrounded by guards, handcuffed and shackled and killed? In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is bringing the world community, that's why 100 countries now are moving away from the death penalty, it has to do with human rights. And the third article of the Universal Declaration says every human being has a right to life. The fifth article says every human being has a right not to be tortured or subjected to cruel and degrading punishment. Is the death penalty torture? Amnesty International has defined torture as an extreme assault, mental or physical, against someone who's been rendered defenseless. Is the death penalty a mental assault? You sit in a cell for 10 years, 15 years, 12 years, and prepare to die. Maybe to die, because I've been in the death house with Dobie Williams, who was brought into it 3 times. The first 2 times he got within 2 hours of death and he got a stay of execution. Okay, Dobie, go back to your cell. Maybe we'll do it later. being brought in again with his family. And in the film Dead Man Walking, you see the family of the executed saying goodbye to their loved one before they have to leave him in that death house because the state is going to kill them. You think it matters to that family that it's not an individual with a gun who kills their loved one, but it's the state with all the legal sanctions taking their loved one and killing them? Is the funeral going to be any less real? And is the torture any less real? We acknowledge that brainwashing is a form of torture, and they may not lay a hand on you. Mental torture, human beings who are conscious anticipate death and die 1,000 times before we die. We don't need to do this anymore, and we can change it tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock when enough of us are awake, and help our politicians to do the right thing, say, you don't have a mandate from us anymore. Apart from the issue that innocent people are executed, even the way, the heart, the essence of what the death penalty is the imitation of the worst possible human behavior to try to teach our children that violence is wrong. I have heard district attorneys say before a jury, we so respect human life that we're going to ask for the death penalty for this person because they killed another person. And some of the kids get it the quickest. Leave it to kids. They say, how come we kill people who are killing other people? Aren't we trying to show killing people's wrong? Or Patrick Quigley, who said to his father was a lawyer who was representing Wayne Feldy, the first Vietnam vet who was executed. Killed a man in a bar, got into a fight, killed a man. Patrick was in his little bed. He's having trouble with monsters. He's 4, pill, sits by Patrick's bed till Patrick goes to sleep. He says, Dad, what are you reading? He says, well, son, I'm reading the case of this man, Wayne Feldy. Well, what did he do, Daddy? And he said, well, he did a terrible thing. He killed a man. He got in a fight, and he killed him outside of a bar. Patrick says, well, what are they going to do to him, Daddy? Bill says, well, they want to kill him. You know, they want to execute him. Patrick says, well, Daddy, who's going to kill them for killing him? Patrick Quigley just graduated from Notre Dame University this year. 3 people have written master's theses on Patrick Quigley's question. And in the end, I'm with him. I walk with him. If you see the film Dead Man Walking, they got it right. All I knew was I wanted to shore up his dignity and be with him. And he said, Sister Helen, I visited with him for 2.5 hours. Who would have thought from that first letter that it would have come to this, that they're going to kill him at midnight? And he's saying, Sister Helen, look, you don't have to be there at the end because it could really scar you to watch. Show up after lunch. And 2 of them nod off during the talk. And now at the movie, people come. And they come not just because of the movie, let's go see The Nun played by Susan Sarandon kind of thing, but because the movie helps people to reflect, and we're at a stage now with all the innocent people coming, even if in principle you're for the death penalty, like George Will, who once called the death penalty noble, you're at a point, but not like this. And that we can find the place in our hearts now to take action, to start moving in another direction, the first step of which will be the moratorium. So we have a little time for questions and comments and dialogue, and then I'll be over there where the books are. Be glad to sign them for you. Amnesty has the moratorium petitions. Can y'all make yourself available to people so that people can see them? They'll also be over there by the books. Urge the college students not only to sign the petition if you're ready to do that, but to take blank ones and to help distribute them so that we can gather signatures here in Indiana, that not only will you do the study, but you'll have a moratorium even as you do the study. So let's open it up now. How are we doing on time? Where are the bosses? Where's the chief? Who's in charge of this operation? You got a runaway nun on your hands here. What's our time frame? We're fine. Okay. Yes.
I wondered if you were aware of Indiana's policy of providing 2 specially trained lawyers in death penalty cases and providing them state-funded investigators and experts, and how you think that policy might mitigate. The county bears 40%. They're also allowed to have experts and investigators.
Okay, they're allowed to have experts. Well, sure, that's a heck of a lot better in Louisiana, where, you know, the cap is like a couple of $1,000 and you can't get money for, you know, expert witnesses. Yes, that's a mitigating factor, where people might say it's fairer here, but you're not going to be able to change the fact of the highly discretionary power of DAs, who they plea bargain with, who they don't. And in Nebraska, you had a legislature who went and looked and said, look, we got 10 people on death row, and they provide them with good attorneys too. But we got 10 people on death row. He did a little study, found there were at least 150 people who had done crimes every bit as bad or worse. And he says, why have the 10 people on death row? He said, why don't we just do away with this, and then they pass the moratorium. So there are other factors that you can't change in it, even if you're taking some steps in the right direction to provide good attorneys. Yes, in the back. Yeah, that may be really hard to believe. It's 6 to 8 times more costly to have the death penalty than to have life in prison. And here's what I found out, and this is documented in the book, and a number of people have done these fiscal studies. District attorneys will be the first ones to call a capital case the Cadillac in the criminal justice system. Because first of all, you got to eliminate all the people from the jury who are against the death penalty for whatever reasons, religious, philosophical, whatever. Then you're going to have 2 trials, one for guilt or innocence and one just for sentencing because it's a death case. Then you have a mandatory review by state Supreme Courts because it's a death case, where some of the court time in Florida, more court time is spent reviewing death penalty cases, over half of their time, and all that's taxpayers' expense. Then you got to build a special part of the prison. You got to put in extra security, and that's just by having the death penalty as part of the system. And then you got to wait until the appeals process is done to execute the person. You put all of that together. Texas spends $2.3 million for each of these people. And if they go for the death penalty and they don't get it, that's factored in too. California, it's $5 million. Florida, it's $3.2 million. I don't know what your fiscal analysis is, but everything about it, because as they call it, the Cadillac of the system, everything about it is more costly. Life imprisonment is estimated at about $400,000. The death penalty always, and you think of those resources. Think of the resources of what we could be doing to work with at-risk kids. The first time they step across the line with the law, if we gave a mentor to those kids and started working with those kids instead of just letting them spiral on down into worse and worse crimes and then to have violence exploding. Think what we could do with community policemen. Think what we could do with working with kids, at-risk kids in the public schools. Think of what we could do with those resources. And I don't believe that you separate the moral issues on one side and the practical, like the money, on the other. I think the way we spend our money and our resources is a very moral issue. And you can't be simultaneously putting it into life and putting it into death. Somebody else? Yes? $144 executions by George W. Bush, including his inauguration day where he launched the first. And now during the campaign, he's tampering on down, you know, just 1 execution a month. But if you look at the schedule after the election, all the executions resume. And he calls himself a compassionate conservative, and he says he believes in Jesus Christ. And I was opposite him on Larry King Live after the execution of Carla Faye Tucker. And I prayed to God not to puke on TV. I was so angry at this man, I could have... After Carla Faye Tucker was executed, George W. Bush got up there and he said, "This was hard for me. I prayed for Carla Faye Tucker." He said, "God bless Carla Faye Tucker." And Larry King switched right to me. Go to the nun, right? Here we got religion. He said, sister, what do you think of that? And that's when I really had to pray. I mean, because it doesn't do any good to... I just said, isn't it interesting when we start bringing in God in this discussion? And Governor George Bush has just said, God bless Carla Faye Tucker. He didn't bless Carla Faye Tucker. He had the power in his hands to save her life, and he didn't do it. And now he's saying God bless. And the way religion's used, God... People quote the Bible. You know, give me, you know it. What's the favorite, most quotable quote from the Bible to support the death penalty? Eye for an eye. Isn't that interesting? An eye for an eye. You know how many times that's said in the Bible? 3. And the 3rd time was by Jesus, who says, you've heard it said an eye for an eye, but I say to you, don't even let the sun go down on your anger. Not only pushing us not to return violence and hurt, but to deal with the anger inside of us, which, if we allow to continue within us, will erupt in violence. You know how many times mercy is spoken about in the Bible? Over 2,000. Guess which one is the quote? And here's what I figured out, and it's a real human thing, and I like to do it too. If you're debating with somebody who does not like to quote the ultimate authority, namely God, who agrees with us in the debate, as God has said, and people fish around in the Bible and selectively quote it. And so if you go to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Testament, during the time of the Mosaic Code, when they're a nomadic community trying to make their way across the desert, they had 37 different crimes for which you could get the death penalty. Sassing a priest, touching sacred objects in the temple, adultery, they never mention the adultery one. And so they select the murder one. Those that shed blood shall have their blood shed. Well, what about all those other ones that you get? What about those? Should we do those too? Isn't that in the Bible too? And people just are selective in it, and they try to pick it out to have God agree with them so that they can quote an ultimate authority. There is a progression and a direction in the Scriptures. And when you come to Jesus, he was executed by the state. If he had even whispered to one of the apostles, get vengeance for me. But he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. It was clear what Jesus said about forgiveness and loving enemies. If he had even whispered to one of them, the Acts of the Apostles would be filled with stories of the assassination of Pontius Pilate, the killing of Caiaphas. It would be just a bloodstream of violence unleashed. Jesus clearly was a person, and who became our Savior, those of us who believe that Jesus was the Son of God and revealed the heart of God to us, who never believed in returning hate for hate. And Lloyd LeBlanc, he was so clear about that. He said, I don't feel it now, but I know what Jesus told me to do. And he said, you know, if I let that hatredness and bitterness stay in me, it's going to eat me alive. And I don't want them to have that kind of power over me. And he chose the way of love. One other person. Yeah. You're teaching the prison system. Ball State has a prison?
I believe it in all my heart.
Good.
So, and I'm going to tell you that death penalty,
You struggle with it.
yeah, because the alternative is to come up to line.
Yeah.
My family's in cases. I know a little bit, not a lot. Now, I've gone to those places. I don't know very much. Because the guys who probably go to my people top in the prison system,
Yeah.
I know a little bit.
Yeah.
And people are so alive. I had a friend said to me one time, Ray White, another professor, said, you're not a liberal. The worst thing you could say to me, why, was you mad at him? I said, how can you say that to me? You know it's like because you're for the death penalty. I said, I was better to me than being pinned up like an animal in a cage for the rest of my life. I'd better take the injection because you're not a true liberal. Well, maybe that's true, but I don't want to be confused with being a revenge-oriented,
No, because and here, there's a real good point. This is a struggle for a lot of people. If people are not executed and they are sentenced to life without parole, which is really serious business in a lot of states, is that humane too? And you're saying if you were given the choice, you would rather take the execution than live in a cage for the rest of your life. Well, here's the thing. We're human beings. Maybe you might want to make that choice for yourself. I'm going to tell you, most of the human beings that I have worked with and known others who work with, when human beings are up against it, life or death, they're going to choose life. They choose life. And here's the other thing you got to remember. If we take it upon ourselves to decide for them that they are going to be killed, they don't have a choice about it. No executions are voluntary. You know, sometimes people give up their appeals and they said, oh, we have a voluntary execution here. There's nothing voluntary about this, because if the person changes their mind, it's got nothing to do with it. The state has decided that we are going to kill you. And I'm finding with Eddie Saunier, who's serving 2 life sentences, the first job of a prison is classification of prisoners. And prison is a tough place to be, no doubt about it. In our prison at Angola, they have books written about this prison, how tough it's been. But the first job is classification, which means that prisoners who are the most violent, the true sociopaths, who kill and like to kill and have killed plenty of people, are going to be put in a special lockdown part of that prison to protect guards and to protect other inmates, and maybe even to protect themselves from other inmates killing them. Eddie Saunier's been able to live a human life. He's growing as a human being. He's working in the welding shop. He's close to being a trustee, which means that sometimes we can have a picnic visit with him. At least there's life, which means there's a chance to grow. And now he does kind acts for some of the older men in his dorm. He gives freely of himself to them. He doesn't act out violently anymore. So here's the thing. Who gets to decide that? Maybe you would choose death, but up against it, I'm not sure. I might say that too, but boy, when I'm up against it, and then maybe you've met people in the prison and you see, hey, I can read books. Hey, I can have conversations with people. Hey, I can be a decent human being here and even minister to my fellow inmates. I don't know. Thank you. Okay, Chief. Thanks so much. Hey, you've been great.